Hi everybody, Terry Ryder from Hotspotting. Every week I write a column for Property Observer, and the one that was published this week spoke to some of the anomalies that appear in price growth data quite commonly and are reported almost daily in media. I spoke to the absurdity of trying to take all the activity that occurs in a major city like Brisbane or Melbourne or Sydney and distilling it down to a single growth figure, which says Brisbane house prices are rising by 3%, for example. I used the case study of Sydney, a city of almost 5 million people, depending on how you define the Sydney metropolitan area, and a place of over 700 suburbs. And those suburbs include places as diverse as Newtown, which is towards the centre of Sydney, quite close to the CBD, versus Campbelltown, which is way down in the far southwest, very different markets. Or places as diverse as Macquarie Park versus Macquarie Fields. Macquarie Fields, again, being way down in the far south western suburbs of the Sydney metropolitan area and one of the most down market suburbs in the whole of Greater Sydney. All these places are very different. Different things are happening. They're all moving in the same direction, at the same speed, but the research companies seek to come up with a single figure that says that Sydney prices are growing by X% in annual terms. And it's kind of ludicrous to even attempt to do that, but that's what they do, and media publishes it, and they present the figures from each individual research house as if they're factual, and then make all kinds of sweeping interpretations of the importance or the significance of these figures. But just to illustrate how empty some of these figures are and how contradictory they are in terms of one figure from one source versus figures from another source. How much Sydney house price is growing in annual terms at the moment? Well, according to one source, SQM Research, it's 7.5%. Still growing quite strongly. But Domain, which is one of the big research entities in Australia, says only 4%. And CoreLogic, which is the one that's quoted the most in the media, says it's only 0.1%. In other words, they've stopped growing. So one source says they're still growing at 7.5%, and another says they've stopped growing. So who do you believe? In terms of Melbourne, how much are Melbourne house prices growing in annual terms? One source says 8%, one of the other sources says 11%, and one of these three sources I'm referring to says 23%. So we've got a range there from 8% to 23%, depending on which research source you choose to believe. But at least they all agree that market's moving in a certain direction or not. Is Adelaide rising or falling? Well, it's doing both, depending on which source you believe. Is the Perth property market recovering after 4 down years, or is it not recovering yet? Well, it's doing both, depending on whose figures that you choose to believe. The Melbourne house market is either up 5% or it's up 18%. Depending on whether you believe SQM Research or Domain or CoreLogic, or you could also throw in ResidX and the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and they all have different figures for all these different markets. And adding to the confusion for real estate consumers reading all this nonsense in mainstream media, you have an extra level of absurdity introduced by economists, because not only do they want to talk about a whole capital city as a single market, they want to talk about Australia as a single market. So they'll come up with a single growth figure for all the markets in Australia, and that is just at the really crazy end of analysis. It's misleading. It's basically useless information. I don't know why media even bothers to report it. So just to further emphasize that within Australia we have many different markets, not all moving in the same direction, not all moving at the same speed. In fact, I would say right now, just amongst the 8 capital cities of Australia, we have a 5-speed market going on. But within each city, you have all sorts of different things happening as well. And in my column on Property Observer this week, I made the point about the Melbourne market and when the different parts of that market peak according to the sales activities. Well, most upcycles, and we've seen an upcycle recently in Melbourne, it's almost at its end. Most of these upcycles tend to begin in some central point, and over a period of years they ripple out from the centre. So you don't have the whole of the Melbourne metropolitan area growing at any one time, or certainly not at the same speed. So in terms of the the very expensive inner southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, the so-called prime suburbs, the ones where median prices tend to be over $2 million for houses. That market actually peaked in terms of sales activity early in 2014. But the middle market areas, the ones that now have median prices around maybe $1 million or a little bit over, those suburbs tend to have peaked in the early part of 2015, while the outer ring areas, the ones that are more affordable, way out at Cranbourne, down in the far southeast, or markets in the local government area of Hume in the north of Melbourne, those markets, some of those markets hit their peak in 2016 or 2017, or some of them are pretty much at that point now. Wyndham City down in the far southwest heading towards Geelong, that market's still pretty hot, lots of activity there, pretty much at its peak now. So you've got a range of peaks hit by different sectors of the market spread over a period of 4 years. And it just illustrates the point that within one city, there's lots of different things happening. They're not all moving at the same time. They're not all growing at the same speed. And it's really very misleading to try and distill all that disparate activity down to, you know, a single growth figure and make the statement that Melbourne house prices are growing by X. So I'll just remind you of the 3 different figures. The latest figures from 3 major sources, CoreLogic, Domain and SQM Research. One says Melbourne house prices are growing right now at an annual rate of 8%, another says 11%, and another says 23%. Who do you believe? Well, I tend to suggest you probably can't believe any of it. It's all rubbery figures to a certain extent because of the impossibility of a task of distilling all the activity in a market as big as Melbourne down to a single growth figure. I don't know why they do it, but media laps it up and gives them lots of free publicity. That's probably why they do it. This is Terry Ryder signing off for now. Talk to you again soon.